Everyone, and welcome to this session with our Regulatory and Public Affairs team. There's loads of people who've joined us for this lunchtime, so that's really great to see. Thanks ever so much for that. So we're here, the big billing is the Mansion House reform, so we'll definitely get into some of that good stuff, but there's also been a fair few papers that have kind of dropped over the last few weeks, kind of spanning regulation, public affairs, pensions. So we're going to try and get into all of that good stuff as we go through this session. So I'll just go around my little windows first of all and introduce you to my fellow cats if you don't know them already. So from my end, then we have Tom McPhail, who is Director of Public Affairs. We have Alison Gay, who is Senior Public Affairs Consultant, and we have Mike Barrett, who is Consulting Director. So I'm not used to giving all of you guys your formal job titles. So hello and welcome. Nice to see you. I think it's one of the thing with this format is I think everybody knows the drill by now, but I always like to just recap it for people. So there's a chat down the side where you can ask questions as we go through. I'll kind of keep the conversation going and just kind of drop into the sort of questions as and when. And if you want to ask questions away from the main chat, there's an ask a question button and that just pops up directly to me and I can ask the question. So as I said, we're going to talk about the Mansion House reforms. So Tom, I'll kind of come to you on that first of all, and then we'll kind of get into everything else that's kind of landed, sort of proposals, plans, papers, and kind of implications for advisors and providers really. But let's start there then. So that was the kind of, when was that now? 2-3 weeks ago, something like
About
that?
3 weeks ago now, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe if you could just, for the people who are watching this, just give a bit of a brief recap of what that covered and why that is important, and perhaps some of the areas that are kind of particularly perhaps giving you pause or think might be worthy of further discussion.
Sure, thanks. So we had Jeremy Hunt giving his speech to the Mansion House banquet to the City of London on, from memory, it was the Monday evening, and then early the following morning, the government started dropping in all these policy papers and statements, most of them coming from the DWP. There was at least one from the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and there was a bit of stuff from the Treasury as well. It was the nearest thing you actually got to the government publishing a coherent strategy on what it plans to do on pensions. And let's just kind of acknowledge up front that there's all a bit of a kind of element of Schrodinger's policy reform about all of this, because we have got a general election coming at some point in the next year or so, and so we might see a change of government, and so you just got to acknowledge there's some uncertainty around the long-term path of all this, because most of the stuff they published will take at least a year to get rolling, and some of it will take quite a lot longer than that. The headline stuff, I guess, in the Mansion House speech really focused on two areas. One was illiquid investment, and we can get into a bit more on that. And the other was really around consolidation of the pension sector. And when you start drilling into the papers that they published the following day on trustee training and culture, on value for money, that was a policy statement rather than a consultation paper, but there were several consultations as well, on decumulation from trust-based pension schemes, on small pot consolidation. Through all of this stuff, there was this underlying thread. It just kept coming back to this agenda of we want fewer, bigger, better run pension schemes. And in that respect, I think what we saw 3 weeks ago is really quite revolutionary, really quite seismic in terms of the impact it's going to have on the UK's pension provision over the next few years. And whilst I've said there's a general election coming and so things could change, I actually didn't see much in all of that that is likely to get completely binned by an incoming Labour government if we were to get a Labour government next. And Rachel Reeves has actually come out, the Shadow Chancellor has actually come out and talked herself about her intentions around getting pension fund money invested in illiquids. So there's that on the record already. But even on all the other stuff, on the small pots, on the value for money, on pension scheme consolidation generally, I don't think this is particularly politically contentious. And I suspect that if we got a Labour government coming in, they would pick up a lot of this stuff and run with it anyway.
So that's kind of signalled the direction that we're heading in regardless. So that's good. So let's kind of try and unpack some of it a bit more then. So we started with illiquid investments at the top there. So just explain what's kind of under discussion here, and why that's maybe a break from what's gone before.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. So I've been having lots of conversations with people around the industry over the last 10 days or so. Unhelpfully, I went on holiday just after these papers dropped, so I had to do a bit of catching up since. But I've been talking to a lot of people across the industry about this kind of stuff. And on the illiquid, so broadly, they're saying that we want to get pension fund money invested in the real economy, helping growth, particularly with DB pension schemes, which are heavily invested in bonds these days, a lot of money in gilts. So they want to get pension fund money plowed into the economy, stimulating growth, stimulating jobs. Illiquids, well, that's private equity, that's private debt, that's infrastructure. It covers a multitude of sins. Paul, I'm just going to pick up on your question there straight away. I think there is a conflict there, and there's a real tension between the political agenda on all of this, which is fairly self-evident, what I've just touched on, and which might be intended to help them win the next general election. But actually, I think it will take too long for this stuff to feed through to make any material difference ahead of the general election anyway. But it is a political agenda about the economy. And is that it?
Not hear a little bit about the FCA's new competitiveness objective, because that ties in directly with what Paul is asking there, I think. So all the Mansion House stuff really kicks off the post-Brexit regulation agenda and gives the regulators the powers to regulate. Now that they are the only ones in charge of UK regulation, and gives the FCA a secondary objective of UK competitiveness. So they've got to think of that in terms of everything that they do. So in answer to Paul's question, yes, possibly, but so yeah, the regulators have to promote the UK. But it's a secondary objective. They've got to take their other objectives about consumer protection and keeping the markets functioning. They've got to look at those ones first. Sorry.
That's the higher priority. No, thank you. No, it's a good intervention. And I think when you come to pension scheme trustees and their fiduciary duty and their obligation to members and member outcomes, then they may see this slightly differently. They may be saying to the government, well, it's all very well, you want this money invested in illiquids, but that might not be in our members' best interests. And it was interesting, one of the papers that came out of the government was a fairly short consultation on trustee training and culture, where they seem to be trying to reinvent what fiduciary duty actually means, and challenging pension scheme trustees to try and take a broader view of this kind of stuff. It could mean investing in the economy, couldn't it? So we had 8 or 9 big DC schemes as pension providers nest amongst them saying, yep, we'll invest in some illiquids. Well, Nest kind of does already anyway, so it's not a high bar for them to clear. And the intention is they'll get 5% of their assets invested in illiquids by 2030. But it's a kind of it's a nice to have. It's a like, we'll do it if we can kind of promise, rather than we're definitely going to do this thing kind of thing. So I remain unconvinced about actually how much the pension investment landscape will have changed a few years from now. And by the way, we are talking, amongst other things, potentially about auto-enrollment default funds here. So it will potentially directly affect the people that people on this call are doing business with.
Yeah, thanks for
well,
that.
on
And so,
the liquid
yeah.
stuff. Sorry, that's a couple of things to jump into mind. I mean, firstly, I don't for 1 minute believe that Tom wasn't reading those papers while he was on holiday. Absolutely, he had his iPhone out on his sunbed or wherever he was. So,
very definition of summer reading, no?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Can't kid a kidder and all that. But I think on the actual topic itself, I mean, there's a really good piece from Andy Bell in Money Marketing, or whoever Andy gets to write his pieces these days in Money Marketing, which talks a lot about, I think it's fair to say the word illiquid almost needs a bit of PR around it. There's a lot of negative connotations with it, and particularly kind of the word Woodford almost kind of automatically arrives in the same or the next sentence when you start talking about it. And I think that feels to me part of the challenge here. And Andy's article, to paraphrase one of the big conclusions, talks about how this is risk reward, and there is potentially higher reward in these assets, but you have to take a little bit more risk around it. And as Tom said, it's investing appropriately, it's asset allocated appropriately, so you're only going to have 5% around there. But the whole theory around, you are expected to get some greater returns around this, even that feels like that's been poorly communicated. So some fairly kind of interesting promises on the communications out there around, what was it, £12,000 extra in your pension, the types of things which even before Consumer Duty would have got you a slap from the FCA, and absolutely now would not to be compliant. Those promises I don't think help with it. It needs a little bit more explanation as to what is actually going on here. And I think if people start to understand it, then there's good illiquid stocks out there. I mean, AJ Bell's a really good example of what was historically back in the past a really illiquid stock, and has proven to grow and to become listed and become a really good business. So those businesses are out there, but it's got a pretty bad reputation, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose particularly among advisors who saw all of that Woodford fallout would probably be a bit like, okay, so now illiquids are back in fashion, but actually, did we not remember what happened last time around?
Yeah, it's a conversation, if we don't have to, and obviously this stuff doesn't apply to retail investments, to advised stuff, so why have that conversation unless I really have to, will be in the back of a lot of advisors' minds, I think. So.
Yeah, and I think Paul's kind of followed up with a sort of follow-up question around the sort of PI implications. I mean, I don't know, Mike, whether you could speak to that, but sort of including liquid assets in portfolios, UCITS, property funds, all of that good stuff that we've seen kind of in the past few years, on the kind of exclusions that you would see around that. It's that keep it simple and that path of least resistance, and absolutely, if that'll be part of it, I think, for advisors, if they see a question on their PI kind of forms of how much do you have in liquid investments, for example, yes or no, and you kind of know what the answer is going to be depending what you go, or what the impact on your premium is going to be. So that will be part of the mix, I think, here. But as Tom said, the DC pension pots, potentially that's much bigger assets going in there. So it's something that advisors can't ignore completely. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. So away from that, then, Mike Climbs was asking, how does the lifetime allowance changes fit into the Mansion House policies, if at all? Tom, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, good question, Mike. Hi. So I don't think directly it does. I think this was in trainer anyway. So, but it was one of the few points of contention on my holiday. It was my own fault for going on holiday with an accountant, as we got onto the subject of the merits of retrospective tax changes on pension death benefits. And it was a fun holiday, I can tell you. So look, there's a problem with pension fund death benefits. They are too generous, right? Now, and I think there's a legitimate case we made to say, well, once people have got an expectation that money's going to pass on tax-free, it's kind of hard to unpick that. The fact you get all the tax relief putting the money into the pension fund goes tax-free, and then you can pass it on tax-free or largely tax-free to inheritors. It's just bonkers, right? So I'm actually quite sympathetic with the Treasury and HMRC coming along and saying, well, maybe it could just be taxed under income tax rules in the hands of the beneficiary. That seems reasonable. I don't think it was directly related to any of the Mansion House stuff. I think that was different policy teams with a different agenda. I'd be surprised if they back down on this one, though. I think it's just, for all it will annoy people, and I think it will annoy people, and it means having to rethink particularly for those who are subject potentially to inheritance tax, rethinking your death benefit planning. I'll be surprised if HMRC back down on something. All the papers have come out and said, we're doing this. These are the rules now, deal with it, rather than a consultation on it. So there's that.
I suppose that was one of the things, wasn't it, that it sort of felt like it wasn't being openly discussed as a kind of major policy change. It was sort of snuck out a little bit, but definitely from your sense, it's a kind of, regardless of whether we stuck it out or not, this is how we feel we should be taxing them going forward.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that elsewhere there's been a discussion again around, should we even have an inheritance tax? Elements of the Conservative Party saying, well, let's just scrap it all together. Well, okay, that would change things again, wouldn't it? So, but I'm not sure that's ever going to get across the line. So, yeah.
Okay, great. And then just, I guess, finally on Mansion House stuff, then was there anything else you wanted to pick out, Tom, in terms of small pots, value for money, that kind of thing?
So I'll try not to monopolise the whole next hour call on this. So just very quickly, I want to talk briefly about consolidation, because I think it's really important. We had another paper on the intention to consolidate small pots. It's hard going, right? Not the paper, just actually making policy stick on this. So I'm not hugely optimistic that even a few years from now we'll have made a lot of progress in getting people's small dormant pots consolidated into fewer bigger pots. But they're trying, and they've put out a paper on that, and there's going to be a working group kicking off later in the year on that. They mentioned in passing in that paper the idea of stapling and the idea of actually reinventing the whole auto-enrollment architecture, which I think is a very good idea. And I won't dwell on that. We can come back to that if you want, but I think it put a marker down on perhaps the next phase of evolution of auto-enrollment policy. But the other big one was the consolidation of pension entities. We've got 27,000 single employer pensions trust schemes. We've got 37 master trusts. We've got 5,500 DB schemes, mostly close new accrual. We've got one CDC scheme, and we've got a sort of around 1,500 contract-based auto-enrollment pension schemes. We're going to get to a point in the next few years when there are many fewer schemes still operating in the UK. Pressures on trustees, the value for money framework, everything was about fewer, bigger, better run pension schemes, more professional trustees. So in terms of how this impacts on advisors, or other market participants in the UK and the DC world, expect to see quite aggressive consolidation over the next few years. And I don't see anything that's going to stop that happening.
Quite like this idea of auto-enrollment 2.0 or something, and we've done the first phase, and now it's kind of how do we kick this on and actually embed some of that good stuff that we've got already. So that's one to watch. So okay, so thanks for that. You managed to do it in 18 minutes, and I think there was a lot of pages covered in that very small summary, so thanks very much for that. And if we've got time, we'll come back to some of that stuff later. But I kind of wanted to move the conversation on a little bit wider now to kind of, I guess, retirement and the decision making around retirement. So obviously advisors have a role to play around all of that, but it does seem like an area that's kind of increasingly coming in for regulatory and policy scrutiny. So Alison, perhaps you want to kind of give us a bit of an update on where we're at with things like the retirement income advice thematic review and things that maybe people should be watching for around that.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of what the FCA means by outcomes-based regulation. So I think it was either the beginning of this year or the end of last year, they announced that they were going to be doing a retirement income advice thematic review because they were concerned that people weren't necessarily getting good outcomes from the process. So a thematic review it's the FCA doing a lot of digging, and it's going on at the moment. It's supposedly reporting at by the end of this year, so it is ongoing. Various firms on this call may already have been contacted about it because it is underway. It's been referred to in one of the papers that came out of it, and it wasn't just the Mansion House papers that came out recently. There was a whole other dump of papers, which I think we were referring to as the pensions bomb drop in the spreadsheet that we were using in-house.
Good terms.
So for example, the FCA had a look into the Investment Pathways project, and that actually the conclusion about that was that actually investment pathways are more or less doing what they were designed to do. What was quite interesting was that there wasn't actually a cap put on the price that you can charge in this area, and that a few firms were actually charging more than there was a recommendation rather than the price cap. A few firms were charging more than the recommendation, and the FCA couldn't bring itself to say that this was wrong because the firms involved were actually justifying what they were charging, which I think is a very, very interesting point for anybody who is thinking about, and do I win the point for saying being the first person to mention Consumer Duty today?
Bingo.
That's quite interesting for anybody who's trying to work out if their offering is value for money, in that the investment pathways actually seem to have been value for money. So there hasn't been an awful lot in the public domain about this one. There was a mention that this is going to be linked to lifetime mortgages. I think that came out further on. It's something that goes back a long way, and originally there was a sort of assessing suitability project going away that was put on hold during COVID. So this is kind of the next reiteration of a thought that goes a long way back. So just be aware that this is the sort of thing that's going on. And at the same time, there's also a review of the advice guidance boundary, because obviously this is highly relevant in this area. And again, that's, what's it called, a holistic review. And we're not quite sure what a holistic review is, but that's not a term that's ever been used before. But that's another one that's ongoing. So a lot of the work that's going into that. I don't even think we've got a date for when that's going to appear, but I think it won't be before the end of the year, I don't suppose.
And Tom, I suppose on that, sorry to cut across you, Mike, I'll just come to Tom and then I'll come back to you. But just because I'm kind of conscious that it's not just the FCA that's kind of looking at this whole retirement space, and particularly that sort of transition from the words of accumulation and decumulation, but I know the big boss man isn't a fan of either of those words, so we'll say maybe building wealth and retirement or something, but it's not just the FCA looking at this, is it, Tom?
No, it's not. And one of the other Mansion House papers, look, we're back there again, was on decumulation from trust-based pension schemes and the fact that it's just Wild West out there at the moment. And the DWP via the pensions regulator is saying, look, it's an absolute lottery what you as a member get presented with as you transition from accumulation to decumulation. So if you're seeing a financial advisor and he's telling you what to do, well, that's great. And maybe if you're taking pension-wise guidance, that's a help. But it's by no means sure what solutions we're going to get put in front of you from the trust-based world. It could be an annuity broking service. Maybe they'll offer an in-house drawdown. Maybe they'll kick you across to an FCA-regulated contract-based provider, or maybe none of the above. And look, this doesn't look great. I personally would argue that even 8 years post-pension freedom, there's massive uncertainty about how good the decision making is on the part of consumers. And just a plea here, because I'm really frustrated that no one has done any really good quality granular research on the non-advised decision making that's going on by people taking money out of DC pots. If they're just cashing out and taking the money and running, why did they do that? What was their decision-making process? If they've gone into drawdown and they're drawing an income from that drawdown plan, how did they determine what level of income to draw? How often are they reviewing it? There's a huge absence of good quality research around all of that. And that's the FCA who are the good guys in all of this. In TPR land, there's literally nothing at all, even in terms of regulation of what solutions need to be put in front of people. So it feels like over the next couple of years, we're going to see quite a lot of movement around all of that, and they'll be primarily focused on improving the outcomes for non-advised people, but it's bound to have contagion into the advice space as well.
Okay, great. Mike, sorry, I cut across you earlier, so I'll let you make your point now, and then I'll take a question from Steve.
No, it was going to kind of preempt almost Stephen's questions. So I think the RIA review is something which advisors really do need to keep an eye on. I mean, it does feel to me, but on one hand, it's kind of early days yet. So it's information gathering. It's 87 questions, I think, on the survey I've seen. And yeah, I take the point about being transparent, but pretty much every single person I know has seen the survey. It's done the rounds well and truly, I think. So it's all but published on their website, I think, in terms of transparency. So yeah, it's information.
The bother of us asking to see it and just maybe make it public,
yeah.
No?
Slide into my DMs, I'll send you a copy. I mean, it's a big survey, so it's quite easy to kind of zone in on question 46 or something, and you use that to prove your particular point of it. And it's wide ranging in terms of the topics. But I think taking a step back, we know that most advisors, for the majority of their clients, are in the retirement income space, so either about to get there or transitioning through it or beyond. And also we know that in terms of revenue in advice firms, typically it's about 70%, 75% of revenue is from ongoing clients, from existing clients paying fees for advice in said space. So I think Consumer Duty, going back to Stephen's question, does give kind of the answer to this. So I think if you are doing what the rules now expect you to do under Consumer Duty, and you're conducting research, due diligence, and doing your target market stuff, etc., avoiding foreseeable harms, doing your value for money assessments, you're evidencing that those fees you're charging are value for money, then I think Consumer Duty gives you the framework, gives you the answers that they're looking for. I think it would be astonishing if they get to the end of the year and have to start ripping up the Consumer Duty, writing new rules around that. So we'll be enforcing the rules that have been in place for about 11 hours so far today, or whatever it is.
I think I can answer the first half of that question as well, is that although today is implementation day, people were supposed to have had their plans in place last October. And I think that would be the FCA's response to that.
Didn't need to laugh at that point.
So you shouldn't just be starting to do it today.
Yeah,
That was spoken like a true former regulator, Alison.
Yeah. And yeah, I think, as I said, advisors need to keep an eye on this one, but it does feel it'll be sort of a normal course of events on this. There'll be kind of findings from the review and potentially kind of good and poor practice if there's real kind of good stuff to highlight. If there are going to need to be any actions taken, then that's the bit which starts to become a bit disruptive. But that would probably go into another consultation process, so well into next year until having any impact.
Okay, great. Right, I'm going to park the Consumer Duty chat, but we will return back to it. But I'll just, I know, sorry, Mike, cut off in your prime. But I just wanted to put this question to Tom on the point about DWP and decumulation. So Anonymous says the elephant in the room is the half of the document they haven't written or haven't published yet. You can't judge one half without seeing the other. So you might need to put that in context in terms of, have we only got part one of the discussion and we're waiting for the other part?
Yeah, and I looked at that, I was thinking, okay, what is our anonymous writer referring to there? I think it's communication was the bit they hadn't published yet, and they said they're going to come back to, but I'm struggling to remember off the top of my head which bit of the paper that refers to. So give me a hint if so, okay, that's just confused me even more. So
if our anonymous
multitask,
can kind of fill in what they meant by that in the meantime.
Yeah, so I think we're referring to communication, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. All right, thanks for clearing that up, Steve.
Yeah,
Our mystery poster is unveiled. So that's great. So thanks for that. So I think this sort of touches Consumer Duty, but Alison, I kind of wanted to bring you in here because one of the sort of data dumps that we've seen is around the Financial Lives project that the FCA kind of released its kind of latest results on. So perhaps you could maybe tell us a little bit about that and kind of what that tells us about disclosure more generally, and obviously any kind of knock-on effects with Consumer Duty as well.
Is this where I get to talk about disclosure?
Yes.
If
Go.
Seriously, still talking about disclosure. So one of the documents that came out in the data dump was the review of the PRIPS rules. So everybody hates the PRIPS rules. They were designed. They were not designed for the UK in the first place, even though the UK had quite a hand in making them at least workable, because if you hate them now, you should have seen what they originally were. The idea was that you would have a single document explaining what your product was, and the format of the document would be the same across every product in every country for every market. So that was what we started with.
So they would sound massively workable.
Yeah, it wasn't massively workable. So gradually, the worst of the problems, the FCA put in some rules to turn them around not long after we left the EU. But there's now progress underway to actually have a more workable disclosure strategy for documentation. So both the FCA and the HMT are looking at this sort of thing. And they've obviously got a big job on their hands, because the Financial Lives survey that was published a couple of weeks ago, big survey that's done, I think it's done every year or regularly anyway, with a huge number of end consumers. One of the statistics that came out was nearly 5 million people had, I'm actually going to read this out so I've got it right, 4.9 million people who had used firm communications to help them make a decision found they did not help at all. So not even they weren't terribly helpful or they were only partially helpful, it did not help at all. So this ties in absolutely with the consumer duty of consumer understanding objective, in that, there's a long way to go with this, and there's probably going to be a lot of regulation about this, but this is something that people should really be thinking about, is the consumer understanding objective. Are people understanding, are they valuing the communications that people are sending out, and how can you evidence that as well? That's the other half of it.
Yeah. And Mike, I suppose, seeing as we are on day one of Consumer Duty, we should give it a little bit of airtime. I know, crack out the party proppers. But there is something there, kind of, on the one hand, the Financial Lives survey is telling us that provider comms actually aren't all that helpful to the people who need help when they need it. And yet we're also saying Consumer Duty, well, surely you should have had this all fixed by now. So what would you kind of say about Consumer Duty readiness around comms, but perhaps more generally as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Financial Lives survey it's a pretty grim reading, and it reminded me also a lot of the stuff we did early on in the year with the advice gap study, which shows, I guess the good news is that most people recognise that they have no understanding about pensions and investments as well. So there's issues potentially around kind of overconfidence and kind of trying to blag your way through, but yeah, we asked, how confident are you in various financial services products, and pensions and investments come kind of bottom of the list around that. So I think it's a pretty scary document when you look at some of the lack of financial resilience in the wider population. But it's quite a good document to kind of understand the population which financial services are trying to serve. Consumer Duty, I think we've seen evidence in the last couple of hours or so. The FCA have kind of been travelling around the studios of Britain, radio and TV, talking about Consumer Duty. They've flexed their muscles in the directions of the banks and savings rates. So there's a cash savings review which they published about an hour or so ago, I think, which, yeah, they're aiming at the areas with the greatest harm and with the greatest impact. So I think I've always felt for a while the advice sector is going to potentially go slightly under the radar, if you like, for Consumer Duty. They're going to look at banks, they're going to look at building societies and beating them up and getting them to pay decent rates of interest, that type of thing. But that obviously doesn't mean to say the advice sector can ignore it. But most advice firms are kind of there, I think, and are kind of doing the right thing anyway. It's just going to be, we need to kind of see how the next few months come through, and I think it'll be useful when the FCA does get around to looking at our sector, seeing good and poor practice examples. But it does go back to consumer understanding, to take you kind of back to the stuff Alison was talking about, and this lack of understanding. I think there's been a lot of focus on some other elements of Consumer Duty, so foreseeable harms, some of the products and services stuff, a lot of discussion around value for money and evidencing fair value, but consumer understanding has always felt like that's kind of sailed under the radar a little bit, some of the work that's needed there. And actually, I remember talking to advisors at the start of the year who are already saying then, we think this is actually quite a big change for us to have to do what the FCA are expecting us to do for this in terms of our disclosure and our conversations with our clients. So yeah, I just wonder whether that's going to be kind of the potential kind of next big thing in Consumer Duty land. But yeah, we'll watch and see. I don't think there'll be much noise in the advice sector for a few months yet.
Okay, great.
I think it's one of the great regulatory things that has actually cut through to the main press. It's everywhere. It's in Moneybox. It's in the Guardian. And Moneybox said something about 72% of the general public had never heard of Consumer Duty, and they seem to think that was a lot. That suggests that 28% of people actually had heard of it.
That's a result.
Exactly, a regulatory issue. But if I was an advisor, I would be preparing myself to say, what was this article I read about in the Guardian? That means you've got to take my interests and put my interests first.
So
just on the one where it was in the Sunday Times yesterday, it said that advice fees can now be claimed back from dodgy advisors, or paraphrasing to that effect. So it's worth keeping an eye on kind of how people are interpreting this, I think, through the consumer press.
Yeah, I'm picking up on that comms theme and thinking about Steve's question around the comms on decumulation. It was notable that in a couple of the other papers, sorry, back to the Mansion House again, but I think it was part of the theme of today, so I'm going to go there again. So the Value for Money paper, the bit they struggle most with was service and that communication with members. I think that's still an enduring issue. They also put out a public paper on collective defined contribution pensions, which, by the way, from talking to the industry, has largely fallen on stony ground, and maybe collective defined contribution schemes will get off the ground, but no one seems very optimistic about it. The use case seemed most popular in decumulation. You could use a collective defined contribution scheme for paying out people's retirement income. But again, the biggest challenge with it was communication. And how you engage with a member at an individual level and explain to them what the risks and benefits are, what's guaranteed and what isn't. I find it really interesting that after all these years, we've still really made relatively little progress on that basic conundrum of putting in front of people products and services that they understand without having to spend vast amounts of time and money explaining it all to them. And we've still not made a lot of progress on that. And I think that's partly why the DWP is now focusing on consolidation. They hope that better engagement will emerge as a consequence of fewer, bigger, better run provider entities. But that's just in the workplace space. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff as well there. So
yeah, right. So let me come to the chat then. So Alistair has posed our essay question of the day, which is, are weighty consultations and thematic reviews past their sell-by date? In that, could the power have shifted from regulators, formal consultations, Mansion House, all the stuff we've been discussing, to the power of social media? See Nigel Farage. I hope that Nigel Farage is not the new starting point for policy discussion. But Tom, what would you say about that in terms of the balance of where the influence lies, I guess, is what...
I'm so glad you said that one to Tom, not me.
So I think... I hope we don't stop doing consultations, because I don't want policymakers to stop talking to the industry before they introduce new legislation and regulations. So there's that. But I think the Overton window can shift faster these days. I mean, the whole Nigel Farage debanking thing, look how quickly that happened. That was kind of interesting. And they've been bubbling under with the Free Speech Union and their PayPal problems. And I know they've been talking to Andrew Griffith ahead of that. But things can move really fast now. But I'd still like policymakers to come and talk to us before they do stuff, because otherwise they'll get it wrong.
There is actually more of an obligation on the FCA to consult following the new FSMA, because it has new powers, and it also gets new obligations or responsibility for those powers. So it actually does have to consult. And there is definitely a recognition that most firms don't have the time or really don't care about responding to consultation papers which have 75 different questions. So there are various different ways of consulting being considered. So doing workshops, doing live and local events, doing that sort of thing, so that smaller firms, and they're very aware that the voice of the smaller firms is not heard as clearly as the voice of the bigger firms. Because even the trade associations don't necessarily speak for the whole industry, or they end up providing something so bland as to be unusable, because they're trying to represent everybody's views rather than one point of view. So I think the regulators do understand that they're not getting the point of view of the smaller firms, and they're trying to do something about it. But one thing I would say, and I do always say in this sort of circumstance, is if you've got something to say in response to a consultation, you don't need to answer the whole thing. You can, one nicely worded paragraph with a couple of real life examples of why something is a problem, will actually be read and will land. And you'd be surprised how few responses like that the regulator gets. So when they do get things like that, they will go and look at it and say, oh, right, okay, fair enough. It may not turn out the way you want it, but don't think that just because you're just answering one question, it won't be read.
Great, thanks for that. So I'll just pick up Steve Lowe's point where he talks about decumulation. The DWP was his take on it was, we want you to offer CDC. If you do nothing else, make this available. I don't know if that was your reading of it, Tom, but that's how Steve sees.
So I think, I think the DWP has definitely drunk the Kool-Aid, and it wants CDC out there. It's bought into the idea. But it requires the industry to deliver it, and that's a risky enterprise. It requires capital. I think so. Like I said before, I think the industry seems to have more appetite to do collective defined contribution as a decumulation only vehicle rather than as a whole of life proposition. But I didn't get a sense of many rushing forward to roll out these products, and I do think it will be challenging. I think the communication around it and how you get members in, and how you communicate their rights and expectations to them is not simple.
Okay, great. So we've got a bit of time for questions. So if you do have questions for any of the guys and girls here, just ask them. But one of the things that I wanted to sort of ask myself in the meantime was, obviously the thing that comes through loud and clear with all this stuff is that there's a lot going on just now in terms of regulation and policy and public affairs. And so I guess, Tom, you kind of alluded to it earlier in terms of elections being on the horizon and stuff, but I guess what would you all say about this kind of capacity for change, I guess, both on the political front, but also the capacity to deal with change for the people that are watching this, advisors and providers? I don't know who wants to go first on that. I might pick on Tom.
So, I mean, one of the things that struck me about the consolidation agenda is there was a natural limit to the pace that this stuff can go at. Whether you're consolidating small pots and transferring money around the system, or you're consolidating pension entities and merging them together, it takes people, it takes time, it takes systems. There's a limit to how fast you can do all that kind of stuff. So there was also a natural limit to the speed at which the industry can adapt to policy change. And we had pension freedoms where, again, that was definitely a bomb drop. And we had 15 months or whatever it was to get ready for that launching in 2015. And we, as an industry, kind of got ready for it, but we're still trying to put the regulation in place to deal with it 8 years later. I think for a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here, it's pretty big but seismic stuff. So however fast policymakers want to go with this kind of stuff, there's a limit to how fast they can actually push changes through. And there's also, they published all those bloody consultation papers just as we were all going off on summer holidays, with closing dates of the 5th of September. So that actually didn't give us a huge amount of time. A couple of them run later than that. The Department for Levelling Up one runs a bit later. But if they want responses from the industry, they need to work with us on this. And I'm really encouraged by Alison's comments about the FCA taking a slightly more accommodating approach to talking to the industry and coming out and asking questions around this kind of stuff. So, however radical you want to be, there is, if you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off, and there's a risk you destroy the whole van if you're not careful.
Great. Okay. Right. So I'm going to work through the chat kind of bottom up. So I'll just take Philip's question first. So, Tom, you were, he says, rightly saying retirement process is a mess. What do you think is the blocker? I don't think it's the regulation.
So there's nothing to stop firms guiding people through a process, funneling customers down to some useful buffers you can put on their decision making to help them decide stuff. I mean, potentially you do bump up against the advice guidance boundary, and that is currently under review. I think we're going to get to a point over the next few years where regulators get more prescriptive about this and say, this is what we think. We've already had the retirement pathways and the investment pathways. I think we're going to get more of that, where regulators become increasingly confident in saying, this is what bad looks like, so don't do that. This is what we think good looks like if you can steer customers down this funnel without actually telling them what to do, but putting limits on their decision-making process to help them guide themselves towards a good outcome. That feels like a direction of travel. I mean, Steve very kindly commented earlier on in this chat, and I know he and his firm have been strong advocates for better use of PensionWise. And I wouldn't disagree with that. There's a capacity issue there, how many people you can actually get talking to PensionWise and the resources they've got available. I don't think they had a lot of air cover from the last pensions minister. We've got a new chief exec coming in for PensionWise once they for Money and Pension Service once they've appointed one. Can they make the case to say, look, we can be part of the solution on all of this? That's an interesting conversation to be had as well.
Okay, great. So Steve Cameron asked, out of all the areas that we've touched on today, which would you advance as top priority? Mike and Alison, I might ask you to take that one first while Tom thinks about it and has a breather.
It depends who you are, but advisors, I think, as we said, making sure you're doing what Consumer Duty is expecting you to do, and I'm sure most are there already. And then keeping an eye on the retirement income survey when that comes through, because that's going to cut to the heart of what you're doing with most of your clients and potentially how you're getting remunerated for that work as well. So potentially quite a big change, or be positive, a big validation of what you're doing already.
And the advice guidance boundary review, and this sort of ties in with Steve Lowe's question. We may see the FCA as expressing a point of view on providers outside the regulatory perimeter. Well, they've already said more than they ever used to say. It always used to be the case of, oh no, that's not our question, that's for primary legislation, we can't do anything about that. Well, actually, they've moved quite a long way towards saying, well, maybe we do need to start thinking about that sort of thing. So I think we're heading in that direction. But I mean, there's all sorts of other bits of the perimeter that are being looked at the moment. I mean, it looks like high cost short-term credit is not now going to be within the FCA's perimeter, if the rumours are true. So that's quite a fluid situation as well.
Mike, what do you think about that? This idea that we might see like risk modelling firms, cash flow modelling firms sort of come into scope of the FCA. If it's Steve posting, he's kind of encapsulated that in the scream emoji, which probably is about right.
I'm not sure they will. I mean, way back in the day, like 10, 12 years ago, when I was working at Scandi, I was responsible for the risk profiling tools there, which meant I had the word tool in my job title, which meant I got the piss taken out of me in every single meeting and call I went into.
That's
anyway,
pretty much par for the course of the land.
But apart from that trauma, the other thing I remember is that I consistently used to say to advisors, so at the time I knew how those tools worked better than anybody on the planet, but that didn't mean for 1 minute you were going to put me in front of your clients and actually give advice. The advisor is always going to be responsible for what's going on, and the tools, support, advice, they don't replace it. So I'm not sure it would achieve anything actually. I'm not sure it would achieve anything if those firms were regulated. If you're an advisor, you're not going to abdicate all responsibility to Blancat just because our planning tools are regulated.
Yeah, I think the other problem with that is potentially stifle innovation. If it becomes a regulated activity, that raises the risk bar quite a lot. I mean, as long as the tools are being used by a regulated individual somewhere down the line, that's fine. I'm not sure I'd want to see them regulated in their own right.
Great. Right, so last couple of questions then. Alistair asks, out of 10, how many marks for the FCA for their leadership of the Consumer Duty so far? 10 being the best. I feel like I need a countdown clock while people consider their answers.
I'm deferring to Mike. This feels like a question for Mike and Alison, definitely.
To be honest, part of me wants to refuse to answer Alistair's question for him posing the question about Farage earlier. I'm not forgiving him for that one. think they've actually been pretty good so far. I mean, you need to kind of see the next chapter of the story as to how they start enforcing it. But if you've taken the time to engage the material and read it and go to their events and listen to their podcasts, etc., then it's been pretty well communicated, I think. But if they don't follow up on those rules, then the advice community will start to kind of think it's a complete waste of time, basically.
It's been such a huge initiative, and it is a serious change to the basis of regulation. But there has been so much more communication about it than there has been about anything else ever. Then it does sort of balance it out.
Yeah, Alistair, what's your answer? Just so Jono can write a headline of Aviva slam FCA for weak leadership.
Well, if he was going to answer before, he's probably not going to answer now. And Paul mentioned, kind of echoing some of that stuff, that the live events were actually pretty good. And Tom is still duly avoiding answering the question, but that's because he has, regulatory and public affairs relationships to protect, probably. So we'll leave that there. One of the questions we had earlier on was around mention of a tracker. So we've been relatively plug on pitch free for now, but just allow us this luxury of just talking about maybe a service that we're building that can help with all of this stuff and when that might drop. Tom, what do you want to say on that?
Thanks, Nat. So yeah, just very quickly then, we've built a regulatory and legislative tracker, just looking at all the consultations and key policy statements coming out. We're putting it onto our website with links, with summaries. So, I mean, the idea is just to give you a one-stop shop where you can go, where you can look at all the stuff that's going on and stay on top of stuff like closing dates for consultations and so on. And we'll be launching that probably October, I think, by the time it goes live, at some point in the next couple of months. And we hope you'll find it useful.
Thank God we hired Jenny to remind us to actually do that part.
There's a reason why we have a fully fledged marketing team now, right? So if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask them. Fellow cats, was there anything else you wanted to add in terms of all of that stuff? With all of these things, we always cover quite a lot of ground, but is there any kind of parting thought that you want to kind of leave people with, whether that's pensions policy, Mansion House, consumer duty, or another topic?
I guess my closing observation would be we've talked about all the stuff that's going on now and through into the autumn. Then we're going to have party conferences. Pretty soon after that, we're going to go into kind of proper war footing from a political point of view. So my sense is probably the sense of disruption and bonkers announcements coming in from left field is unlikely. The pace is unlikely to diminish this side of the general election, and it feels like the FCA and the pensions regulator have got quite a lot on their plates. But again, I suspect the pace of change is unlikely to diminish.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. Particularly keep an eye on the Labour Party conference, because we haven't heard an awful lot from the Labour Party about what they would do in terms of financial services regulation.
Great. Mike, was there anything you want to add?
Consumer duty, good and poor practice, I think. So I think advisors finding out amongst their own community what they think particularly are good practice and ways they've implemented it, and then listen and wait for the FCA to kind of help articulate and socialise some of that information as well. But also repeating what I said earlier, I think the consumer understanding one just feels like that hasn't had a kind of a disproportionate, less discussion, less noise around it than perhaps it merits.
Okay, great. Well, thanks ever so much. I think I'm going to call it there. So thank you very much to Tom, to Alison and to Mike. Always great to hear from you, and there's so much kind of stuff going on. So it's good to kind of get a bit of a kind of download and what does it all mean. So thanks ever so much for that. Thanks everyone to you at home for watching and for joining us on all these things. We love kind of putting them on and having so many people join us for each one. So we hope to see you at the next one. But until then, thanks very much and see you soon.